So Anya is involved with an incredible organization called Young Humanist International. She is president of that organization and has held multiple roles, multiple organizations of the years, most notably with American Ethical Union, specifically its youth section. She was raised in the ethical culture movement and attended Ethical Society of St. Louis since she was a young child. She runs a business as a writer and currently lives as a digital nomad, living and working wherever she wanders. She happens to be in Los Angeles this week, which is absolutely wonderful, but we're still hosting her virtually. Her passion lies in advocating vigorously for humanist and progressive values, both within and beyond the United States. The presentation today is on intersectionality in humanism, what it means, and why it matters. Anya, the floor is yours.
Thanks for that intro, Evan. I really appreciate it. Hello and good morning / afternoon / evening to everybody here. Welcome and thank you for being here. I just want to do a quick shout out. I see my mom. I see the Finney family in St. Louis are here. I see Tucker in Bogota, Colombia, my friend David Pineda in Guatemala, Bart in the Netherlands. So we've really got a crowd here today. That's very international, you know, and it's a bummer that we have to do so many virtual events, but it's also really great because we get to have such global participation, which is really cool. So real quick, I've been feeling sick since I arrived in California. I keep testing negative for COVID, but I'm isolating anyway and drinking lots and lots of water. So forgive me if I need to wet my whistle a handful of times throughout this talk. Today, I'm going to be referencing both atheists and humanists. And so that we are all on the same page about what these identities mean, I'm going to go ahead and drop the following definitions in the chat. And then later, when we get to them, you can reference back to that. And with that, what I'm also dropping in the chat is a quiz that I will reference later. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So an atheist is a person who does not believe in a god or gods. A humanist is a person who does not subscribe to theism or other supernatural beliefs, and instead follows the philosophy of life that affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good. So the main difference between atheism and humanism here is that atheism is simply the absence of a belief in God, whereas humanism provides a non-theistic framework to discern right from wrong. So let's get started. What is intersectionality? For many of us, it's a new term. Some of us may have heard it before, but don't really know what it means. However, intersectionality is actually not a new term. It was first coined back in 1989 by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, a US-American lawyer and civil rights activist. She first used intersectionality to describe how race, class, gender, and other identities intersect or overlap. So, in other words, intersectionality is a description of how each of our identities interact with each other to create our entirely unique experiences. For example, I'm a humanist. I'm also white, a woman, a non-monogamist, a queer person, a digital nomad with Missouri origins, a person with mental health issues, and a writer. Each of my identities interacts with the others, coming together to create my own unique identity. Now, let's talk about how intersectionality is used. It's often used to describe systems of oppression and how different groups of people are affected by those systems. With intersectionality, we can actually establish a rudimentary scale for measuring the human experience in the context of those identities. This scale can help us begin to understand how marginalized or privileged a person is based on systemic factors that are outside their control. If you want a general idea of where you fall on this spectrum between marginalized and privileged, IDR Labs has a quick and rough quiz, which I dropped in the chat at the beginning of this talk. And according to this quiz, I am at 66.7% on this scale, which places me somewhere between somewhat privileged and very privileged. I just want to note, though, this quiz is very basic and only takes a handful of identities into account to give you a really general understanding of the concept. So take that with a grain of salt. Now, many of you here share the unique identity of being both US American and atheist and or humanist. A bit later, I'm going to explain to you why I use the phrase US American and not just American. But for now, let's focus on the intersection of these two identities, US American and atheist. So, while atheist US Americans certainly have many shared experiences, the experience of being, for example, a Black atheist is entirely different than the experience of being a white atheist. White atheists have to navigate a US society biased towards Christians. Black atheists have to navigate that, plus multiple constructs of institutional racism in the justice system, in education, in healthcare, in everyday life, etc. Then, if we zoom in and focus on the various identities of Black atheists, we see even more divergent experiences. Being a Black atheist man is much different than being a Black atheist woman. Black atheist women have to navigate the same things as Black atheist men, plus constructs of institutional sexism in the professional world, in healthcare, in the home, in the justice system, etc. Then, when we factor in class or income, age, ability, sexuality, and the myriad of other identities that make people unique, this examination of interacting systems becomes vastly more complex. Our identities simply cannot be neatly boxed, particularly in atheist US communities, but especially in the context of our more extensive and more diverse global humanist community. Understanding this is intersectionality. Now, I'm going to shift gears for just a moment to revisit why I chose to use the term US American instead of just American. Let me ask you a question. How many countries are there in America? Those of you with your cameras on, please raise your hand if you know the answer. You don't need to say anything, just raise your hand. I'm going to just flip through, see who has their cameras on, see who has their hands up. Not seeing a whole lot of hands. So I'll give you a hint though. The answer, it's not just one. It's not. The answer is actually 35. There are 35 different countries in America. The thing is, America is not just the United States. There are many people outside the US who consider themselves Americans. After all, America is 2 continents of mostly Spanish-speaking nations. Some Spanish, some Portuguese, French, Dutch, Haitian Creole, Nahuatl, Mayan, and many, many other languages. This is yet another example of intersectionality in real life. The US claims ownership of the identity of American, despite being part of 2 contiguous continents that call themselves American as well. Look, I know calling yourself US American rather than just American may sound kind of weird to you, but think about how weird it would be if Germany claimed the identity European, tried to brand solely Germany as Europe, and didn't recognize any other European nations as European. Imagine if China claimed the identity Asian, but didn't recognize any other Asian nations as Asian. Yet, on the flip side, many US Americans are completely fine with categorizing anyone in the massive African continent as African without recognizing their specific nationality. So, this is why I say US American. I specify out of respect for the hundreds of millions of other people on these continents that identify as American as well. They are just as much as American as I am. Plus, considering the oppressive and controlling history of the US over much of Latin America, the very least we can do as folks from the US is recognize that we are not the only Americans in the world. So, why does intersectionality matter in humanism? As Professor Crenshaw has stated, intersectionality was a necessary development to push law and society towards egalitarianism. She observed that US courts viewed race and discrimination as a universal experience among Black people and gender discrimination as a universal experience among women. She argued that racism is experienced differently for men and women in different minority groups, and sexism is experienced differently for Black women than for white women, and so on. So Intersectionality provides a basis for understanding the nuance of human experience related to our institutions. When we can recognize the nuanced oppression of systems on various identities, we can better identify how to allocate resources and support to create more equitable human experience. In other words, it's a basis for social progress. As humanists, we want everyone to live a life of dignity in a world where universal human rights are respected and states uphold secularism. We simply cannot work towards these goals effectively without intersectionality. Many in our global humanist community, particularly those who insist on limiting themselves to atheism as an identity, make the mistake of focusing disproportionately on secularism while lacking a focus on human rights. But let me ask you this. What good are secular societies that uphold the values of science, reason, free thought, and free speech without a healthy investment in the human rights of the most disadvantaged and oppressed? Both the atheist and humanist movements have been historically dominated by folks whose identities intersected to create some of the most significant advantages in the human experience. What I mean is non-disabled, financially stable, white, Western, heterosexual, cisgender men. These men have had the privilege of not having to experience sexism or racism or discrimination against their sexual orientation or their ability. The worst discrimination many of them have had to deal with is against their lack of belief in a God. And you generally can't recognize an atheist just by looking at them, like you can with other identities. For many of us here, discrimination against our lack of belief in a God is par for the course. But we also have a myriad of other systems of discrimination that we must contend with. You may remember hearing earlier this year about the American Humanist Association revoking the Humanist of the Year award from Richard Dawkins for his history of public statements that, quote, use the guise of scientific discourse to demean marginalized groups, unquote. The AHA was referring to numerous tweets and other comments in which Dawkins waded into discussions of transgender identity and race in an insensitive, ignorant, and intentionally provocative manner. This decision divided the global humanist community. Many people defended Dawkins, saying he was just asking questions and that people were trying to cancel and censor him. But here's the thing. Despite everything Dawkins has done for the humanist and atheist movements, and I will say he has done a lot, he, as a white, Western, heterosexual, cisgender, able-bodied, and more than financially stable man, is incredibly inept at speaking about the human experience with a lens of intersectionality. He failed and continues to fail at engaging in discussion about human rights in good faith. He cried censorship, not because he was being censored, but because his insensitive words were being rightfully criticized by those in the community who have a greater insight into the transgender experience. He cried cancel culture, rather than taking up the challenge to put on a pair of intersectionality glasses and more closely examine the intersection between the humanist and transgender identities. This is not good humanism. And no matter whether you support Dawkins or not, we can all recognize that he made the conversation about transgender identity, an identity which he does not hold, into a thought exercise, rather than yielding the lead of the conversation to transgender folks with very real and not merely theoretical experiences that Dawkins discussed. Now, I give you this example of a humanist leader lacking tact in human rights to say this. As we continue to make social progress using intersectionality, more atheist leaders who won the identity lottery, like Richard Dawkins, will say insensitive things, then cry cancel culture when their lacking intersectional perspective is criticized. We have no obligation to continue revering these leaders if they make no effort to take our criticism. Progressive movements are constantly evolving, and sometimes what's best for the movement is leaving leaders behind who are unwilling to grow with it. We have an obligation as humanists to make our movement more inclusive, welcoming, and diverse if we genuinely want to grow. And intersectionality is how we do this. So, how can we become more intersectional as humanists? Well, at some point, we all have to recognize that winning the identity lottery makes it very difficult to understand what it's like to not win the identity lottery. And when people don't feel understood, they feel like there isn't a space for them to be there. The only way to create that space in the humanist movement, or in any context, is by handing the proverbial microphone to those who do understand. People who hold identities that intersect with humanism and create an experience that's unlike, say, Richard Dawkins. These intersections lack representation and need more opportunities to have their experiences validated. We also need to recognize that we, as humanists and other non-religious folks, need to take the lead on discussions around complex human rights issues. Many self-identifying atheists will tell you that this isn't our responsibility. Those individuals should and will be left behind. They do not have the capacity to carry our movement forward into the future. As we become more intersectionally minded people, we become better equipped to discuss nuance around highly divisive issues, like the Kyle Rittenhouse trial. Now, while I'm sure most of you are familiar with this case, I will briefly describe it so that we are all on the same page. Now, on August 25th, 2020, a 17-year-old Kyle Rittenhouse from Antioch, Illinois, fatally shot 2 men and wounded another with a semi-automatic rifle in Kenosha, Wisconsin, during the civil unrest that followed the shooting of a Black man named Jacob Blake by a white police officer. Kyle said he was there to protect a car dealership from being vandalized and to provide medical aid. At his trial, he pled not guilty, claimed he was exercising self-defense, and then last week, he was found not guilty on all counts. This trial was so divisive that a YouGov poll conducted during the trial found that 2/3 of Republicans thought Rittenhouse should be acquitted, while 3/4 of Democrats thought he should be convicted. I've heard many people ask what this trial has to do with race if the shooter and all his victims were white. It's a good question, and one certainly worth asking. So let's put on our intersectionality lenses and look at this a little closer, shall we? Kyle himself said this case has nothing to do with race. He even went so far as to say he supports the Black Lives Matter movement, which is quite frankly just lip service, since he showed up to a BLM rally with an AR-15 and a stated intent to cause harm, then murdered 2 people and injured another. Instead of Kyle's words, let's focus on how his identities and behaviors intersect. Kyle is a white, hypermasculine, cisgender boy from Antioch, Illinois, who is a staunch supporter of gun rights and protecting property. He is associated with a known white supremacist group, the Proud Boys. Whether that association was by happenstance or intentional became irrelevant shortly after pleading not guilty, when Kyle went out to a bar in Wisconsin to do some underage drinking and engage in photo ops with Proud Boys while wearing a free as F shirt and flashing the white power hand symbol. For all intents and purposes, Kyle Rittenhouse is a white supremacist. While his stated values may not align with this assertion, his identities and behaviors do. Kyle can say he supports Black people all he wants, but he continues to turn around and take advantage of white privilege at every opportunity. Actions always speak louder than words. Those who celebrate Rittenhouse's acquittal, or even those who shrug and tacitly accept his trial as a fair one, are not looking at this with a pair of intersectional lenses. They are making a choice to condone systemic racism. How? Because Using a gun for self-defense is simply not a viable option for many Black people. Yet it remains the standard by which white people can immunize themselves. Black men are 20 times more likely to be killed by guns than white men of the same age. Yet Rittenhouse bought and carried an AR-15 because, and I quote him, "it looked cool." According to the Violence Project, a nonpartisan research group that tracks US mass shooting data dating back to 1966, white men are disproportionately more responsible for crimes of violence. So what does this trial have to do with race? Everything. But two very important takeaways to note. One, it pulls back the curtain over the double standard in the US justice system for Black and white people. We can't even speculate what a trial for a Black person in Kyle's shoes would have looked like, because it's highly unlikely an openly armed Black man would have made it out of that night alive. And two, the survival of oppressive ideologies is the most important thing to white supremacists, and they will stop anyone who is a threat to their doctrine of hate. That includes white people who stand as allies to Black people. A white supremacist will target a fellow white person if that person is an ally to the group the supremacist is trying to oppress. White people who take a stand for equality for Black people are therefore subject to supremacist violence. This supremacist ideology is a threat to human rights and secularism everywhere. And this is why we must prioritize intersectionality as humanists and atheists, to put a stop to these doctrines of hate. This is why we need intersectionality. Some final thoughts before I open up the field for some Q&A. These conversations about identity and privilege are tough and often really uncomfortable, but they're necessary for growth. And the good news is that it gets easier with practice, and there is no shortage of these conversations to be had. It's so important to prioritize receiving feedback from people with less privileged identities than ourselves. Each intersection is an opportunity to grow, learn, and become a better version of yourself. And each intersection is an opportunity of mutual benefit for both humanist communities and the communities we intersect with. My hope is that over the next 20 years, we see humanism blossom into a more inclusive and diverse global community by exploring intersectionality. Thank you for listening to me today. And now I believe we will open up for questions.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. I'll lead the Q&A because you learn as a leader not to hand microphones out until you're ready at events. So we will, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and then we will go for about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll turn off the live stream and people can ask directly. So first question is kind of the difference between privilege and power. You know, I just want to quickly have us go over again the definition of privilege, because I think the way it's talked about academically and in activism circles is very different than how some people colloquially talk about privilege. And you described it as a unearned identity, essentially. Could you describe that a little bit more?
Sure. So if we, for example, if you click into that quiz that I sent you in the chat, the IDR Labs quiz, basically they put identity on a spectrum. At the lower end of the spectrum is very marginalized. On the top end of the spectrum is very privileged. So if you look at it that way, everyone is born into these identities. They don't choose them, and they fall somewhere on the scale. Everybody does. Everybody. Everyone is some degree of it, and when you look at it that way, it's something you're born into. You're not asking to have privilege. You just have it. You're not asking to be marginalized. You just are. That's essentially what I mean when I'm saying privileged. I hope that.
Can you talk about the value and meaning that has? Because I think, I grew up doing these social justice workshops called the Privilege Walk, where you ask very similar questions as that quiz, and people step forward or back. And part of the misconception usually for the privileged folk in those conversations was that it meant like you're better or worse suddenly. So there's this confusion that we think that because you grew up white or rich, there's suddenly like a value attached to that. But I think you're describing something different. So I'm going to make us hit it 3 more times just so there's no confusion when we discuss this a little bit later.
Sure, absolutely. So no, there is no inherent worth. That's what we're arguing as humanists, is that there is no inherent worth to having these identities. We all have worth as human beings, but the systems that we are subjected to are trying to convince us otherwise, which is why we when we see that spectrum, our brains correlate privilege to good and marginalization to bad, because we're correlating, oh man, if I'm born into this, then I'm good. If I'm born into this, I'm bad. So do away with the moral structure of that. And we're just looking at the spectrum of, this is what it looks like. You get to decide what you do with that privilege. Evan and I are very privileged. We're both white. We have so much privilege, but we get to choose what we do with that privilege. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does to me. But if people have questions, please put that in the chat. I filled out the survey. I'm extremely privileged, to the surprise of no one. Okay. I had a question around like the nuance of identity. So you described, when you gave a list of identities to start your talk, that you had many of these that you have no control over. And yet I think people would argue things like writer, which you described yourself over, that you have more control over. Can we get into the nuance and difference between some of these identities and what they mean, both structurally and personally?
Sure. So when we say identity, that's a really broad term. But when we get into the generalizations of intersectionality, what we're generally talking about are these identities that we're born into that we have no control over. When I said I was a writer and I'm a digital nomad, those are things that I have control over. Those are things that I chose for myself, but they are pieces of my identity, and they do intersect with other parts of my identity in a way that create who I am as a unique person. So that was to give you kind of a rough and tumble idea of who I am as a person. But yeah, for the sake of exploring Intersectionality 101, we generally look at these identities that are, ones that we're born into that we don't have any control over, because once we get into that extra layer of the identities we choose, it becomes a much more complex conversation. And, like this conversation is pretty difficult to get into just on the ground floor. So I hope that clarifies a bit.
Great. And speaking to identity and privileged identities, there was someone in the comments that was ranting about how essentially identity is what causes the problems in society, and used nationalism as a great example. And I think most people would describe nationalist identities as what can lead to the separation of groups and can cause moral atrocities. And yet you're describing a benefit in us talking more about identities. And so I'd love if we can dive into the nuance of the difference between the way we look at those identities and how systems look at those identities.
Sure. Yeah, that's a really excellent question. And I think one of the main things we need to look at here with this question is that nationalism is taught. You're not born into nationalism. Nobody's born and knows they're American, US American. Nobody's born and knows that they're anything. They're taught over time that they are a certain thing, and they're socialized to believe that their nation is somehow superior to another, or nations outside, their nation. And that essentially forms an identity that it's propaganda. It's not really it's not the same kind of socialization that we get as as women, as as people of color get, as there's other identities that come into play regardless of where you're from. And nationalism is a result of man-made borders. So it's kind of a weird intersection. It's definitely an interesting intersection to explore. But that one, I think we need to put an asterisk on that one, because it's a very propagandized, and there's some constructs to it that are not quite the same as the other identities that I've referenced.
Great. We had a comment from Bart who said, thanks for the talk. I've been arguing for intersectional humanism in the Netherlands for a while. If your humanism isn't intersectional, it might be tribalist. Now, it's clear to me that the intersectional approach / analysis brings to the humanist movement, but I do wonder what humanists could bring to the intersectional movement for justice in your view.
Ooh, that's a good one. And that's one that I've been kind of been arguing for a while now, is that, so this is great, because a lot of non-religious organizations, particularly in the West, are very trend older. And Evan knows this. Evan and I talk about this all the time. And a lot of these organizations want to know what the obstacle is in preventing these younger generations from joining up with our cause and really getting involved in humanism or atheism. And Evan and I say every single time, it's the causes. We're not backing causes. And essentially that's what we can bring as humanists to the intersectionality space. We can be doing more to support other organizations that have aligned values. Let's say, for example, the ACLU. We could be doing more to support what they do. You know, there's so many organizations out there. And you know what? We don't necessarily have to exclude religious organizations from that. Sometimes when we want to get stuff done, joining forces is the best way to make that happen. And, you know, we're really facing some uphill battles here. And I don't think it's worth parsing out, you know, oh, well, they're religious, so we don't really want to join up with them. Well, if they're aligned on LGBTQ values, and maybe it's worth it. I mean, you know, so there's a lot we can be doing to bring more to that intersectionality movement. And I think that's harder for older humanists to accept than it is for younger humanists, because we kind of grew up, you know, this was our thing already. We just kind of grew up in it. So, you know, that'll have a twofold effect. It'll attract more young people, and it'll do more for the world in general.
It gets me thinking a lot about your comments about the secular movement or humanist or free thought movement for the past 40 years, and kind of the conversations that are happening now and how aligned or different they are from maybe the leaders that were running those organizations 40 years ago. Because specifically, I think about how secularism is often looked at in what I call a silo, like it becomes the only thing we talk about. And in that context, it becomes a theism versus atheism conversation. Mm-hmm. And yet, if we put on the goggles, which I love the visual you always gave us when you did that, when we put on the intersectionality goggles, suddenly we would be using value language, and we'd be talking about human rights versus fascism, or we'd be talking about critical thinking versus dogmatism. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious if that's what you're seeing when you're having these conversations, or if it's something different.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that really frustrated me when I started to network outside of the ethical humanist movement, specifically with other humanists, is that, you know, there was this fixation on the theism versus atheism debate. And it got really old, you know, really fast, because, you know, there's so much more going on, and there's so many more intersections with, you know, atheism and feminism, and, you know, it's like you're looking at atheism and theism here. You're looking at this intersection on this street, a 2D view. And then if you zoom up, you know, in your little drone view, you see the whole city, you see this entire grid system, and you see so many different intersections happening. And that is, I mean, that's essentially intersectionality. I mean, there's so much more going on, and we have to talk about it. So that's what I found frustrating with you know, people specifically that limit themselves to just atheism as an identity, is that they're, you know, categorizing themselves as something that they aren't. And that's very limiting, and it keeps you from having these really nuanced and fruitful discussions, frankly, that we need to have. So yeah, and it's intimidating. This level of nuance and the depth that intersectionality can go, super intimidating. But I mean, it needs to happen, and you got to start somewhere. You do.
We had a comment from someone who says, I'm an elderly woman who's been in science since the 60s. At no point did I ever experience difficulty or lack of respect from my male colleagues. I've enjoyed a fulfilling career all of my life. So I think the question would kind of be, what of the people who didn't experience the barriers or challenges or overtly systemic oppression that we often are associating with marginalized identities or marginalized or systems of marginalization, what of their experiences? Like, how do we talk about those?
Good question. You know what? I'm really happy that you didn't experience those things. That's really fortunate. And I mean, that's what we should all be experiencing, honestly. Like, we shouldn't have to deal with that ever. So I'm glad that you have lived the ideal experience. What's unfortunate is that many of us don't. Many women in science don't have that same experience, and frankly, many women of color in science really don't have that experience. So what I would say to that is I would yield to other people who have had adverse experiences and really listen to what they have to say, because just because you had a great experience doesn't mean that someone else doesn't. Oh, the question is why. Okay, why with I'm sorry, why about what?
Why did they have a normal experience, maybe?
I would assume it's hard to say without talking to this person more directly, but my assumption would be it's because they didn't quite have the lens that we now look at these things with. Maybe if she put on some intersectionality glasses and kind of reviewed and reflected on some of her experiences, she might have seen some more microaggressive acts that she might not have first construed as being maybe sexist, but now it's, oh yeah, okay, that was a little bit sexist. And I'm not saying go look for these situations. I'm just saying you can reflect on these situations and kind of see, oh man, now that I'm thinking in these terms, I might have missed that the first time around. So yeah.
We had a great animal ethics question come through. It's clear humanism still has its work to do on intersectionality. Do you think the approach of sentientism, explicitly trying to expand moral concern under a new brand, is a better or worse approach than trying to shift humanist values? And that's usually to expand and discuss animal ethics and veganism and our definitions and moral presence in all animals' experiences.
Okay, so is this essentially a semantics question? Are we kind of asking if it's more worth it to call it, sorry, what was the word? Sentientism?
Sentientism.
Sentientism.
I forget who created that specifically. Neil, you can post in the chat a little bit more, but there basically was a bit of a rebrand approach. That's what I'm calling it. There's probably better language, but arguing that humanism, while it says the values, it doesn't live the values very well, and it does center human moral experience over other non-human animals. And so sentientism could be a more effective term and movement to gather around, which I think myself and you might call humanism similarly, but as a new brand, because it doesn't center humans even in its brand.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'd say, I would say that humanism does value non-human life, does value animal life. Maybe we don't do it well enough. That's frankly very worth discussing. And if we needed to rebrand to call more of that advocate for more than just humans in our identity, then that's something that I think would be worth discussing. But my opinion is that we, as a life stance, take that into account.
We had a question from Greg: how can we help white folks demonstrate their dislike of racism in marginalized / non-white cities? The sound bites are important, but are there any interactions that are more effective?
Okay, so this is a question about how to better ally with Black Lives Matter, essentially, and against white supremacy. Okay. Yeah, so, well, one of the best things you can do is really engage with the local groups. Most cities have groups that are existent already and already do this work. So reaching out to them and getting an idea for what they need from you is the best way to do that. I think, there's some organizations in LA that do that. And correct me if I'm wrong, Evan, I think you're connected to those groups and you guys do some work with them, no?
We got a lot of work to do. I won't claim success where we don't have it.
Sure, but yeah, so I'm saying that I think the best means of pursuing, intersectionality around that specific subject matter is to reach out to organizations that are doing the work already and get a sense for what they need.
Can we explore that concept? You said multiple times we should be centering marginalized voices in conversations about human rights and justice. And I think that is counterintuitive to a lot of people that grew up in a skeptic or secular academic movement that says the best argument should always win. And we're essentially creating bias by taking something as simple as an identity and saying that their ideas are more valuable, which I think is a misconception. But I want you to kind of articulate why it might be a humanist or a rationalist approach to center marginalized identities.
So I just want to, before I do that, I want to take a moment to challenge the idea of the best idea wins. I think that is a concept that we've kind of drawn out from capitalism and a free marketplace of ideas, which is incredibly important. But when you pit ideas and arguments against one another like that, it can be a dangerous precedent, because then when we get tied up into human rights arguments, what you end up doing is the best argument wins. And then if somebody's human rights are tied up in those arguments, then that person loses. So this is why it's so important to consider, there are voices that are not being heard, and you might think you hear them, but there's a chance that you aren't, and you're not taking into account, these multiple perspectives. So I really want to challenge that idea of the best idea wins, and I want to challenge everyone here to take on the practice of cognitive dissonance and really sitting with conflicting ideas and being with them. I mean, it's possible to sit with two different truths that are opposing at the same time and really sit with them, because that helps you open up some space, helps you, get that drone view on the intersectional city. It really helps expand your understanding of our life. And I think, you can still be skeptical and explore multiple perspectives. You don't lose skepticism by abandoning that competitive idea framework.
Right. And I think they're arguing that you abandon that if we only listen to certain voices, which again is a misconception I never understood. It's this idea that by prioritizing voices that have been underheard, we're somehow not listening to voices that have always had big microphones. It was always confusing to me.
Yeah, it's not pie. We can all be heard if we make an effort to listen. So by taking the microphone away and giving it to somebody else, that's not making them less heard. They just don't have the microphone right now. So
it's like most people don't have Twitter accounts the size of Richard Dawkins, so maybe you have to follow some other people to hear different views. Yeah. Okay. Let's see if there's some more questions in the comments I might have missed. Okay, I had one more around, let's see. Oh, what about, like, there's lots of conversations now which Dawkins stepped into around transracialism. You know, we have popular figures like Elizabeth Warren even who were claiming Native identity. And the question here is, how much should outsiders be able to claim and discuss other people's identities versus allowing people to completely claim their own identity? You spoke a little bit to Kyle Rittenhouse and his words versus actions, but I just want to make sure we cover this because we do have people claiming identities that society or academics would maybe not give them. And how do we square that?
Yeah, that's an important thing to touch on. So the issue with this transracialism, or I'm not really sure where that it sprouted up from the Rachel Dolezal situation, I believe. Those types of things are really touchy because these are, again, identities that people are born into. And when you're changing identities like that, when a white person is, essentially posing as a Black person, they are taking the benefits of being Black, but they don't have to take the bad parts. So they're basically using an identity to gain without taking on the terrible parts, frankly, of that identity. And one could argue that's kind of abusive. It's not very fair to the people that don't have that choice to appear as another identity. And it gets a little hairy because, in the next 20 years, this country, the United States, is going to look a lot more mixed race. And, what appears to be white, what appears to be Black, it's going to be a completely different conversation in 20 years. So it's going to get really hairy. But it all kind of comes back to this like validating perspective, right? And if we're not listening and hearing people out, then people are going to be pushed to the extremes. They're going to pendulum swing this way, and they're going to say, well, you're not allowed to say that because I am this and I'm not being heard. And if you say that, then you're even invalidating me further. So, we really start to divide and get super divisive with language and semantics when people are not understood. That's why it's so important to have these conversations, because we open them up and we can see the whole picture. And it's a messy thing. But really, it just comes down to, well, is it possible, like, let's take Elizabeth Warren, for example, is it possible that she is benefiting from that identity without having to take on any part of the negatives associated with that identity? And the answer is yes. And that's harmful. That's not fair. So yeah.
Right. And if we're to get more into the nuance of it, I do think some people are using it to oppress, but they're claiming that trans identity is being used similarly, where people are choosing to take on like a male identity, essentially to like choose that privilege. I think choice is the key word here when talking about privilege. Further, I always cringe a little bit when I see different things go viral on the internet around like a picture of a group of people, and society has decided if they're white or Black, and we no longer talk about the nuances of identities, which aren't like, I can't tell all of your ethnic backgrounds and identities that come with those just by looking at you all the time. And yet we have to be able to discuss that sometimes, and finding the nuance of those conversations has been challenging for me, right? Like,
Yeah,
we
it is
see
challenging.
President Trump's interns, like we can easily say like, this is a very different crowd than President Obama's interns. And yet we know there's probably a lot of sub-identities that would be described by some of those people if we were to have some conversations that we don't see from just a photo. And as we get more mixed race and interesting with our sub-identities and privileges, I'm intrigued by how we're going to have those conversations better rather than worse as we try to put on more intersectional, as we can talk about the Oscars being so white.
Yeah.
And yet, like, also need to have a deeper conversation about like what your personal identity is.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that doesn't need to be a question. Okay. Anything else before we call it? I think we're gonna turn off the recording here. I want to thank you for your time, for being with us while you're sick. For those of you attending, I'm going to turn off the live stream right now, and I will open the microphones for you to ask some questions directly. Thank you. Hope you all check out atheistsunited.org. Bye.